Having already become familiar with the logic of this Armenia-Russia-Turkey malicious triangle last time, it's normal that questions should be raised about how everything was perceived by the political class of Armenia and the political scientists during the years of independence, and what policy was adopted by the state of Armenia. This is a very important question because it seems that many things are happening in the world now. The prominent slogan of the return of America and the movement of the superpowers, some extremely serious issues related to the states affecting Armenia, our region, mainly at the heart of the escalations in China-USA relations. There are such tectonics happening in the international politics that it seems that it should be the only thing worth worrying about and understanding. But what's the whole thing about? Are today's political system of Armenia and the politicians able to realize this at all? What I see now is that even the 44-day war brought very little change. This is really interesting. Certain processes of reunion, reinterpretation should have started. But in reality, we only face accusations towards different officials that have acted previously, even presidents. Who's right, who's wrong? And what was spoken for 30 years is being spoken now. The categories, the criteria that were set in political discussions and arguments during those previous decades are still present. Certain Turkish-centered or Russian-centered worldviews and arguments are circulating. The problem of security remains the same. The arguments are the same. Why does everyone all over the world speak in different categories, trying to evaluate things, and we're still in our traditional categories? I don't know. The world is based on power. The world is against us. We're weak. We don't have beggars. Should we fix relations with our neighbors? Or, I don't know, should we be rivals? No, really, these are the same things. During the last, maybe not 30, but already 100 to 150 years, they are the same categories through which we try to understand the world. But these destructions that exist in the given period of time, that have existed and will exist, show that we have never been able to understand the world properly. Who speaks of, for example, rights in here? What are rights? What is power? Where does power come from? We all say that we should be strong. We should rely on ourselves only. And this goes on for centuries. We say this all the time. But in reality, we do the exact opposite. All these talks started in Armenia in 1991, when the Third Republic was declared independent. Lots of people, especially those our age, remember all that clearly, all these direct arguments between the Dashnaktsutsun party that had returned to Armenia and the ANM party. A whole new process was taking place. The Soviet Union was falling apart. It was divided. The well-known perestroika, initiated by Gorbachev, was announced in the state, and it created a corresponding reality in different regions, including ours. But the interesting thing was that between these arguments, there was an impression that people were speaking of the reality of 1918 to 1920. Very interesting. It's like there's a documentary film about that era. But the script is a 30-year-old text. There are several factors that affected this mindset. The first one was the Precedent Approach. In this reality of the 90s, people constantly wanted to see the previous, the old reality. They wanted to compare things all the time, as they all grew up and matured, surrounded with all this literature. And the second most important thing was the balance that was created after World War II. And it was called Cold War, a static period that has also had a big impact on people's consciousness. As if the world was sort of an iron. And it really was so. A legal, political, military iron cage where no changes could happen, and one shouldn't even try to set forth any issues, anything that would be out of these circles. That was a deeply rooted mindset of a generation that was step by step becoming a political class in Armenia, or in other places. And these two factors have created a certain mindset which already got fixed in the political life. I wouldn't say that this mindset has left a substantial impact on the processes taking place in the 90s. The processes continue in correspondence with the disintegration and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the accordant battle, our war, the others' wars, all this was related to that. But there was something different. People could see something else. It was Turkey. Turkey, which at that time we can say had nothing to do with these processes. These processes were between the West and the Soviet Union, in the territory of the former Soviet Union. And the factors were from there. But in our people's consciousness, it would always seem that Turkey was involved somewhere. A rather interesting thing. Maybe it was the same in Azerbaijan. It seemed to me, too, that this is a different world from 1918 to 1920. And if I have to come back to the logic of that triangle, this is where the absolute ruler of the territory was the weak, weakening, detaching Russia. And it was cooperating with Armenians. Do you hear that? With Armenians, not with Turks. It was cooperating with Armenians. And with them detaching, we became stronger. All those who tried to cling on to the reality of the Cold War, all of them lost, including Azerbaijan. Those who wanted to keep the regime created during the Soviet Union, none of them understood that those were already dying atavisms. That's what happened, really. But we speak of Turkey, Turk-centered worldview, and so on. We can just simply discuss it. I'm telling you, its effect was practically non-existent if there wasn't one important factor, a factor that became decisive for Armenia. And whatever happened today has its direct roots in this factor. And what is it? That's, as I call it, a policy of waiving rights. That is, by constantly thinking that some processes were taking place which were the same as they were in 1918 to 1920. People began to act, formulate, and implement the policies on the basis of the conclusions that were made at that time. Right during the existence of the First Republic, already after the Sovietization in the 1920s and the 1930s, the dispute took place within the framework of the ARF party. Why? Because realizing that there could be other results, another future for that First Republic, people came to certain conclusions. I have read the material of all the leaders, like maybe if things were another way, or if we didn't rely on just this one, for example, if we spoke to the Turks, things would be in a different way. This would happen, that would happen, etc. These ifs, just ifs, like they say, well, maybe this wasn't enough. For some reason, at first glance, it seemed there are some theses that we wanted a lot and got very little. But in reality, it isn't clear yet whether the gains were more than they could really be, or not. All these things were just assumptions, but they had served as basis for debates, that things could be this way or the other way. And this is interesting, that very few people, few officers of the time realized that you're not the one to make decisions. You couldn't decide a thing. The ones that made decisions were Bolshevik Russia and the New Turkey, which no one ever understood. When the Sultanate Empire collapsed, a new phenomenon erected, which was some kind of a Russian-Turkish symbiosis. Through the Russians, with the participation of the Turks, the New Turkey was created, and they were the only ones to decide. No one else here could. The role of those superpowers is a bit exaggerated as well. We will speak of this within the frameworks of a separate topic that is a very important thing. I just wanted to show this genealogy, where that argument comes from, and what it appeared on the 90s politicians' tables like a copy. This is the most important thing. In the end, what is the essence of that policy? Indeed, try in every way to keep away the different Armenia created in the territory of the Soviet Armenia from any legal responsibility that goes beyond those limits. It was done consciously. People were sure that this is the only way. We're in conflict. We're in a war with Azerbaijan, and whatever we do or don't, yes, we do something with the Russians, but the Republic of Armenia must not have any legal responsibility for anything. This was first noticed when, in the 90s, when the Declaration of Independence was adopted. Factually, it wasn't concretely formulated that Armenia is an independent state. It was in bits and pieces, like laying foundations of independence, including the fact that with the famous decision in 1989, we rejected the unification of Artsakh with Armenia. This is the first thing. See what's happening? In 91, a referendum was held in the territory of Armenia, the Soviet Armenia, and a separate referendum was held in Artsakh. The Republic of Armenia didn't react to this at all. And on the contrary, as the Soviet Union had already collapsed on December 8th, it joined the newly created CIS, which back then was called Independent States, and signed a document according to which, equally with all the other states, the 12 states, recognized the sovereignty of Azerbaijan and the existing borders. This happened on December 21st in Alma-Ata. It is interesting, very easily, and the Karabakh issue never entered the CIS agenda. Nobody ever mentioned it. There was no such issue. I remember back then, when I wrote about this, several people wrote that it had no legal basis, this and that, but people never understood that the foundations were already laid. That was when the basis for the assessment of the Karabakh problem was laid. Why? As the European Union, it was called European Council back then. The 12 states had an objective to recognize the countries of Eastern Europe, the newly created former Warsaw Pact countries, and the new countries created in the territory of the Soviet Union. They had a decision of overriding importance. It was on December 16th, where they had said that, for example, in any case, the right to self-determination will be given priority. They will approach the issue in accordance with the norms of international law, but will discuss each case separately, taking into account the existing political realities. That is to say, each country, whenever an issue arose or was recognized, could lay that issue on the table. These were our new problems, as they were ready to do it. But when on December 21st, all those 12 states said, no, this is how we're going to act, there are no borders, you recognize sovereignty and move on, at that time, they put their paper aside too and recognized it automatically. Do you realize what happened? Does it matter what a CSI document is? A lot of people say Azerbaijan didn't join it for 2 years. Indeed, Azerbaijan fell apart. But when Heydar Aliyev came to power in 1993, he immediately did ratification and entered with the same principles. But no one cared already. The interesting thing is that Karabakh was fixed in the world as an Azerbaijani region. And that was it. In 1992, Armenia and Azerbaijan, which were recognized by several states at that time, easily entered CSCE, the main European structure, which first of all referred to sovereignty and territorial integrity and borders. They entered, and the Karabakh problem was already fixed within the framework of that structure. It was fixed that there is such an issue, that the states took initial responsibility, they recognized it exists, it must be resolved peacefully. But what was the real issue? It was the problem and the conflict of the Armenian Azerbaijani communities in Nagorno-Karabakh, a region of the Republic of Azerbaijan. You see where it went to? And nothing changed after that. This president blamed the other and vice versa. I don't know. It was this project or the other. Doesn't matter. The problem was described as such, and the minimum rights that the Armenians of Artsakh received were given to the Armenian community living in the mountains. See what happened? Essential issues. And on top of it, you see, they would hope that if you don't mention this or that right, step back, keep silent. It strengthens you. During the same period of time, a whole different policy had started in Azerbaijan, especially after losing the war in 1993. Heydar Aliyev, who I already mentioned before, who at that time was the president of their parliament, turned to both the deputies and the people, saying that there's no need for unnecessary noise. Karabakh was gone, it was handed out. He said that it's necessary for them to keep the rights on Karabakh. No rights should be given to Armenians, no instrument ever. Then we will recover, and if not us, our children or their grandchildren will bring it back by force. And that became their policy. Fight for rights. They would fight even for the most insignificant documents. Then it joined CIS with the same principle, reinforced its rights, left Artsakh with no rights. And you see, in that entering, accepting process, again, no one raised a question. No one said Aliyev recognized the existence of the Karabakh issue. No one condemned Azerbaijan when they entered CSC in January 1992. As I mentioned earlier, Azerbaijan immediately breached it. 2 weeks after, on February 13th, it started a war with heavy weapons. Nobody condemned them. Armenia didn't raise that question. Again, for what? The policy of waiving rights on the one hand. That is to say, you present everything, put the paper, sign it, without thinking what rights are. Power generates rights. And on the other hand, decades for each right. Why? So that today, realizing that for some reason there is some interest in the world for Russia to enter the region. That is a fact, isn't it? Russia entered Azerbaijan through the 44-day war, occupied Karabakh, and gave the rest to them. Shared. That's a fact. Everyone said, this is the territory of Azerbaijan. Who are you? Who needs recognition, right? They say, why didn't you recognize? But what did recognizing mean to us? Waiving rights in the same policy was the central phenomenon that I fought against as hard as I could from day one. No one should ever recognize. In 92, I remember it well, when we had some failures, the fall of Shahumyan, Martaker, the question was put forward. The opposition demanded recognition, and if only you could see what a fierce struggle there was to prevent it from happening. And up until 1994, we could easily recognize it, right? Very easily. There was no Azerbaijan. Even Russia couldn't bring its troops at that time. It took a mandate, took everything, organized negotiations to bring his troops to Karabakh, just the way it happens now. Even Russia didn't manage to do that. But see, again, no one took that step. Why? Let me put it briefly. The factor of Turkey, the very factor that it was always rooted in the people. The factor wasn't there, but it was in people all the time. Do nothing in Armenia. Do nothing that could raise doubts. This is the only way they looked at things. And it's in this very society that the status quo was created, which had two components. The territory is ours, there were no other troops, and the 100% rights belonged to Azerbaijan. It's obvious that one day they would explode. Someone would like so, right? This is what that policy was. And today, as we try to evaluate things, we need to see whether we change something with our approaches or not. Do we have the same attitude towards state rights or not? When they say, let's talk to Turkey, to this one, to the other one, do we have something to say? How should we treat the situation we have in Artsakh today? There was one status quo. Now appeared a whole new one. What comes to the previous status quo? At least we relied on ourselves. The army fought fierce battles with terrible casualties, but the population was saved. But who is the master there now? Russians are. How will they behave there? Does anyone ask this? Interesting. Do we need to recognize, at least today, the changing presidents also didn't take that step to think, well, should they give any status? Should they change that nasty thing, the status quo or not? They made it, a means of blackmail. If there's war, we'll do this. All of them. No one took Aliyev's words seriously. It's now that everyone says, there's no point. Azerbaijan would add some things upon our agreement, some conditions, right? But didn't we understand that? Didn't we understand that now as well, he, the president of Azerbaijan, says that he wouldn't ever sign a single document? Of course he wouldn't. There was a definite policy set, clear, understandable. But it seemed to people that, someone would force Azerbaijan to come to some agreement. But why should they come to an agreement? When Azerbaijan came to agreement, it was forced to do so, to step back against Russia. His father, Ilham Aliyev, didn't allow the troops to pass, with Azerbaijan completely destroyed. Even in that state, he said it's better to leave it to Armenians than to give it to those. But they forced this one, and he raised his hands. Up until now, no one can understand this. In Azerbaijan, too, people said, we don't get it. What was the point of this? You gave it to Russia, and now it'll do whatever it pleases. Today it took Karabakh from Armenians and gave it to us. Tomorrow it will take and give it back to Armenians. And we already need to try to understand why we thought that way, where that negligence of law comes from. Aliyev got rights to use arms, right? He had to get the rights from the world first, then use it. Conditions were created for him. Everything is based on right. Even people in the criminal world are well aware that you can't solve any problem with a weapon until you get the right to use it. But we hope that eventually we can discuss these questions and raise interest. It's not like there are no ready materials. A lot of people have conducted brilliant research, but you understand, there are no criteria for perception. Why? Because now these false beliefs are so deeply rooted that people can't even comprehend the ready-made material ready. But we need to do that. And to do so, I think we need to dig a bit deeper into that thinking. For the more I study, I see that the system of false beliefs is very deep. It has been created during a very long time, and it seems it constantly refreshes itself. I don't know, deepens its roots in other generations. And probably this is why we need to, like a lot of people are now interested in what sort of people Turks are, and what are Armenians and Russians, and we need to try to get a good understanding of, well, in the end, the Armenian as a thinking being, as a world-perceiving being. How did he come to this thinking in general? What is it from? Is it from family? Is it coming from history? It is clear. There are thousands of factors that I've studied a lot, and I think it is necessary to look briefly at those phenomena, to look at ourselves more clearly. The same goes for Turks. They write millions of things about Turks, say a lot, starting from neighbors up to rivals, right? Many different things. Yes, but who are Turks? Surprisingly, by doing research, I developed a good understanding of these people. It's not about good or bad, neighbors or not, this doesn't matter really. The question is, as thinking beings, how do people think? This is very important. And after this, the real problem of the Armenian-Turkish relations will become clear. What is the main problem? I did not say in vain that when you go to talk, what are you talking about? Do you know the problem to talk about? Previously, I said, there was such a case already, when we spoke with Azerbaijan on the basis of interests, right? That the Russian troops must not come, and not that they were our neighbors. We want to have good relations with them. We are still rivals. It's the interest that decides everything, right? But coming to this interest, before coming to it, we need to see the problem. It's this problem that has never been formulated. That is why everything concerning the Turks is only assumptions hanging in the air. And we continue to live with those assumptions on and on. We'll come to this.